Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on building household financial security during COVID-19 and beyond. We are about to begin our presentation. We hope that you are well situated and we're looking forward to joining you for the next hour with a rich presentation. We would like to make sure you have some logistical information before we begin. Everyone in the audience has been put on mute. We ourselves as presenters will be joining you on audio only. We won't be using video today, just to minimize any bandwidth concerns coming through the presentation. We'd like you to share any questions you have for our presenters using the question box, and this is located in the control panel at the side of your screen. We will be holding several minutes at the end of the presentation for a Q&A period, so we would definitely like to hear from you today. We do have one handout for you, also in the control panel, and this is a PDF copy of the deck that we are using for the presentation. However, we will make sure that we share all webinar slides and a recording of this webinar with everyone registered within a few days. So you'll be able to share the information with any other colleagues or friends in the field who would benefit from this presentation. We would like to begin this session by acknowledging that we are joining you today from Toronto, which is situated upon traditional territories. These territories include the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community on this territory. We acknowledge and thank everyone on the line joining us from traditional territories across Turtle Island. We are honored to be having this discussion with you, and we thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. We're joining you today from Prosper Canada. Founded in 1986, Prosper Canada is a national charity dedicated to expanding economic opportunity for Canadians living in poverty through program and policy innovation. As Canada's leading champion of financial empowerment, we work with governments, businesses, and groups to develop and promote financial policies, programs, and resources that transform lives and foster the prosperity of all Canadians. We help service systems and organizations in all sectors to build proven financial empowerment approaches into their businesses in ways that are sustainable, help them achieve their goals, and increase the financial well-being of the low-income people they serve. We have a rich presentation for you today. We'll be spending quite a bit of time with a presentation on post-COVID financial vulnerability in Canada. And we'll be joined by several speakers from the Boston Consulting Group Social Impact Ambassador Program. They'll be sharing a lot of recent data on the financial trends that we have seen in Canada across employment, benefits access, wages, and much more. And then following their presentation, we will have a Q&A, and we'll be joined by Liz Mulholland, CEO of Prosper Canada, who will also share a little bit about what Prosper Canada is working on in these times. Depending on the sector part of the sector you work in, you may well have very deep experience with a lot of these financial trends and may well have seen some of these impacts firsthand. And we hope very much that today's presentation will add to and deepen that context. I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel for you here today. We've got several great speakers. Our first three speakers here, Abby, Ada, and Brian, are from the MBA program at the Rotman School of Business. Abby is from Calgary. He has an undergrad in mechanical engineering from the Schulich School. Prior to his MBA, he was a project engineer advising on sustainable energy extraction. Welcome, Abby. Ada is originally from Vancouver. She has an undergraduate degree in cell biology and genetics, as well as nursing. And prior to her MBA, she worked as a registered nurse in trauma. So welcome, Ada. Brian is from Toronto. He has an undergraduate degree in commerce and economics from the University of Toronto. And prior to the MBA, he did a variety of roles in marketing and analytics at Tim Hortons. So welcome, Brian. Fourth, we have Stephen Iyer. Stephen is the founder and lead consultant at Common Good Strategies. He regularly publishes and speaks on social trends in Canada. And fifth, last but certainly not least, we have Liz Mulholland, who is the CEO of Prosper Canada. So welcome, panel. We are excited to hear from you today. And before we get started, we want to make sure that we hear from the rest of you in the audience so that we may know more about you and the part of the field that you are joining us from. So I'm going to invite you to participate in some polls if you would like. First, we'd love to know what part of Canada you are working in. And regrettably, GoToWebinar only allows us 5 fields, so we've had to do some clustering here. Loosely speaking, are you from the west, the north, the middle, or the east? We've divided it out geographically. So we'll give you a minute to respond to that poll. I'll close it in about 15 seconds. All right, I'll close in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So we have a pretty great representation from the West and from Manitoba and Ontario. And thank you everyone to those joining from Quebec and the East Coast. We certainly welcome you as well. We have about 160 folks on the line, so that surely means we have good representation from many different parts of the country. But we'd love to know more about what type of work you do as well. Are you joining us today from a community agency or a not-for-profit organization? Are you joining us from federal or provincial government or a municipal government? Are you in the private financial sector or are you in a part of the field not shown here? Feel free to add more comments in the question box if you'd like to add more detail if you fall into that other category. I'll close this poll in about 10 seconds. Closing in 3, 2, and 1. So thank you very much for sharing. It looks like around 2/3 of you are joining us from community agency or other not-for-profit work. Welcome. Another 8 and 6% of you are from various levels of government, and then rounding out private sector and other financial or other different types of organizations. So thank you very much. That tells us some great information about the type of work you do. But we're not quite done yet. We have one more. We'd love to know if you do offer programs which are financial in nature, how would you describe them? And of the options here on the screen, you can click as many as are relevant. You're not limited to one. Financial coaching, counseling, problem solving, one-on-one type of work, tax filing or benefits access support, consumer advocacy, credit counseling or debt counseling, or again, if you have an other option, please feel free to tell us more in the comment box. We have a few people responding that they are also involved in research or the university education sector, so thank you very much. We have several folks listening in from the education and research sector. And I'll close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, so an overwhelming number of you offer one-on-one financial support, coaching, counseling, problem solving. And then it sounds like you all are doing quite a lot of support in tax filing and other types of consumer support. Our panel today, this gives you a wonderful snapshot of the types of financial support our audience works in. So thank you again. This really is wonderful to hear. So this is enough from me for the moment. I'd like to turn the presentation to our CEO, Liz Mulholland, who is going to tell a little bit more about the research presentation you're going to see today. So Liz, over to you.
Thanks so much, Glenna, and welcome everybody. When the pandemic began, it was really apparent to us at Prosper Canada that we would need to understand its evolving financial impact on Canadian households, particularly low and moderate income households, if we were going to respond effectively to the urgent needs of Canadians, both during the crisis itself and during the lengthy economic recovery that we now know is gradually unfolding. We were delighted, therefore, to receive the generous offer of a pro bono research team from the Boston Consulting Group. For those of you who are not familiar with BCG, as it's fondly known, they're a leading global management consulting firm with a large presence here in Toronto. So I'm extremely pleased to have our BCG team with us today, along with Steve Eyre from Common Good Strategies, who led the research team. We're going to share their research findings with us. Specifically, they're going to discuss COVID-19's impact on the financial lives of Canadian households, what other countries have done to support people financially through the crisis and the recovery, and how Canada can also help households to rebuild their financial health and participate fully in our economic recovery. So without any more ado, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Page and his team from BCG and Steve to share the results with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. So if we start off on the next slide, as Liz just mentioned, the purpose of our research over the summer was to really identify how has COVID affected household finances in Canada and what should the government do about it. And really through our research, we found 5 key reasons why we think that financial help services should be a priority. And we want to walk through each of these in turn with you today. The first reason is quite simply that COVID-19 is threatening the financial well-being of Canadian households. And I think when we move to our second reason as well, this is especially concerning because the tactics and programs that households are currently using to make ends meet are not sustainable for a long-term recovery. And as a result of this, we're worried that there could be a record number of households facing insolvency as they transition off of some of these shorter-term programs like CERB, debt payment deferrals, and things like that. Coming up in the coming months. The good news is that there's actually proven financial help services that can increase the financial well-being of vulnerable populations. And actually, there's a lot of other countries out there who've already realized this and started investing in financial help services as a key component of their economic recovery plan. So really coming out of this presentation, we're really calling on the Canadian government to invest in financial help services as a critical component to Canada's economic recovery and to help Canada build resilience against economic shocks in the future. So we're going to go through each of these now, starting on the next slide with the first component. We just wanted to give a pretty high-level overview of the economic impact COVID-19 has had on Canada. So the following data is from the Canadian Labour Force Survey done in August. So the data are done in September, so the data is updated until the end of August. And as of the end of August, there were still 1.1 million Canadians who had lost their job due to COVID-19, representing about a 5.7% decline in employment since February. On top of this, there's just under 800,000 people who've also lost at least 50% of their normal hours worked. So they might still be employed, but business is much slower and their income and hours worked is being significantly impacted as a result. So overall, we see that there's about 1.8 million Canadians who've experienced some sort of significant decline in their income since February. And unfortunately, low-wage workers are the ones who are most severely impacted by this. Now, if we progress to the next slide, we do know that the worst of this economic impacts are behind us, at least hopefully. So I think if we look at the chart on the right, we can see that before COVID, the unemployment rate was about 5.6%. in May of 2020, this is really where Canada hit their peak unemployment at 13.7%. And in fact, this is a bit understated because a lot of people just left the labor force entirely, so weren't even technically counted in this number. And now, as of the end of August, unemployment was down to 10.2%. So we are starting to make some improvements. The concerning part, though, is that, as Liz was mentioning, the recovery from here on out is expected to be very gradual. So in the Canadian government's economic and fiscal snapshot back in June, they were forecasting that unemployment was still going to be 7.2% by the end of 2021, which means that, you know, in about a year and a half from now, there's going to be still 1.5 million more Canadians who are unemployed compared to where we were pre-COVID. So this is very clearly like a long-term effect that we're going to have to deal with. If we go to the next slide, however, what we're really concerned about is that a lot of the tactics that Canadians are using to make ends meet during this crisis are fairly short-term and might not be suitable for a long-term recovery. So if we look at really like the three main tactics that we've identified, on the one hand, we have income support, right? So as of September, there had been 8.8 million Canadians who had received CERB from the government. But we know that CERB just came to an end at the end of September. And as we transition from CERB to EI, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people who are going to fall through the cracks. Now, the Canadian government has done a really good job of tweaking tweaking EI to make it more accessible to more people. But Steve, a bit later on in the presentation, is going to show the audience, I guess, who some of these vulnerable people are going to be who might lose their income support. The second tactic people are using is payment deferrals. So at the end of August, there were about 2.6 million Canadians who had at least one active debt deferral. So that means they're actively deferring it in the month of August. And finally, when you look at personal savings, it's really interesting to see that even with income supports and even with payment deferral programs, about 30% of the people whose incomes were impacted by COVID are saying that they need to dip into their TFSAs or RSPs to make ends meet. I think this is really concerning because just like we know the payment deferrals are going to end, just like we know that income supports for a lot of people are going to end, personal savings are also going to run out too. And at the start of the pandemic, we were actually going in with historically low household savings rate. So these savings could run out and those people could be significantly vulnerable. Now, on the next slide, you know, we've already talked a lot about, you know, statistics, and I think we're going to have a lot more empirical evidence, a lot more data for you throughout the presentation. But we kind of want to take a pause here just to put a face to some of these numbers that we're talking about, and we'll hopefully reference these throughout the presentation, just to give everybody a more visual idea of the types of people we're talking about and who's affected. So we've come up with two different personas. These are, you know, hypothetical people, but we think they're fairly representative of the groups really impacted by COVID. The first person we want to highlight is James. So James is 21 years old, and he used to work at a cafe, earning $15 an hour. Unfortunately, the cafe shut down permanently, so the cafe went out of business, and so he's been relying on CERB to replace his income so he could keep paying his rent and paying for food. Unfortunately, James hasn't really had any luck finding a new job just because the entire service industry that he works in has been negatively affected. And so he's really worried about what's going to happen, you know, as CERB is ending. So some of these worries could be things like, you know, what are his EI payments going to be like relative to CERB? If he picks up a few hours here and there, is that going to impact his eligibility for EI? How long could EI last? Right? There's really a lot of unknowns, and he was really reliant on CERB before. And so he's concerned that if any of these things go wrong with EI, or if he does not find a job soon, he could likely be evicted by the end of the year. The second persona that we want to identify was Clara. So Clara is 38 years old, and she lost her job as a dental hygienist, which was paying her $50,000 a year. Now for Clara, CERB helped, but it was only replacing part of her income. So she's really been drawing on savings to make ends meet. And this is really concerning because, you know, Clara has two children, you know, aged 8 and 10. And 3 years ago, she just bought her first condo with a large down payment. So she doesn't have a lot of savings to begin with. And the mortgage on this condo is also very big. So historically, you know, Claire's been spending about half of her salary just to make her mortgage payments. Now, needless to say, you know, if she's lost a lot of her income because she's now had to take CERB, and her mortgage is so big, she's probably not going to be able to make ends meet just with her CERB income. So she's decided to put off her mortgage payments, and so she's deferring her payments. But with rapidly dwindling savings and a big mortgage, you know, Claire is really anxious about what's going to happen if these payment deferral programs end, especially given the fact that it's been extremely hard for her to balance, job hunting and full-time childcare. So there's not really any immediate prospects upcoming. So I think really, when we talk about these personas, I think it should be, very obvious to people how this is a very stressful situation for people like James and Clara. And in fact, we've actually found a lot of empirical evidence on the impacts that COVID-19 and the financial stresses have had on people's everyday lives. And so now I'd like to pass it over to Abby to go through some of these impacts.
Thanks, Ryan. Now that we've met James and Clara, I'm just going to quickly touch on the real life impacts COVID is having on Canadian households. So there's a recent study done by Angus Reid, and the chart on the left shows that approximately 33% of the respondents were impacted by COVID-19 and have had financial stress, and 11% were significantly impacted. So this was because of a loss of employment and reliance on the short-term tactics that Brian mentioned a few slides before. So another survey also showed that there's 30% of the people on CERB are in very terrible financial shape. Over 45% have financial stress. And in Ontario alone, calls to 211 have increased dramatically to support some of the financial stress increases in households. So what effect has this had? So if we go to the next slide, financial stress has impacts on everyday lives drastically. So the same survey respondents mentioned that 18% of them actually have had health issues as a result of financial stress. 15% have had relationship problems. 14% experience reduced productivity, whether that's in a part-time job or while they're applying for jobs or just studying. 13% have had family disputes. 10% have had substance abuse issues or other mental health issues. So this just shows that there's an immediate spillover effect on families, workplaces, and demand for public services, and that money, health, relationships, and work are deeply interconnected, and stress in any one of those aspects can propagate in throughout. Let's go to the next slide. Why is this the case? Like, why are Canadians stressed so much? Well, another survey done recently shows that many people consider a CERB to be a complete lifeline, and they'll face significant financial risks once these benefits come to end. So 37% of the survey respondents said they're at high risk of financial collapse once CERB ends, and 36% actually say that they could be potentially impacted. So that's over 67%. Over 70% of the people, which represented a lot of people. I'm going to pass it to Steve now to kind of quantify these numbers and see how people are being transitioned from CERB to the other EI benefits.
Thank you, Abby. So on the next slide, we show here, so the most recent numbers we have was that about 4 million people were relying on CERB at around the beginning of September. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives did some analysis trying to determine how are people going to be impacted, how many people fall into different buckets. So we saw that about a third of people say that they're going to have a huge problem once the CERB ends. And what the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives found was there's about 1,943,000 people who will see reduced support after CERB ends. And about 776,000 of them will be completely cut off from federal support. We're going to dive into that a little bit further on the next slide, but it does show that there are a substantial number of people who, with the new system transition to EI, will not actually be negatively impacted. About 2 million are going to receive the same amount under the new system as they would have on CERB, and about 789,000 or so are going to actually receive a slight increase in the amount they receive. On the next slide, I really want to dive into that 776,000 people who just got cut off from financial support and look at some of their characteristics. Not all of it is bad. About 65,000, that was the estimate they put, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives put, will actually lose support because they're making too much income. That's exactly the sort of thing we want. We want people to be receiving less support because their normal income streams have returned to a sufficient level that CERB's less required than it may otherwise be. But most of the people who are being cut off are in low-wage, part-time jobs who have partially returned to work with drastically reduced hours. So these people will be receiving less funds, but they didn't have a lot of savings, they didn't have a lot of financial capacity, they weren't in a great financial position to start with. And this is disproportionately concentrated in the largest cities, where there has been a growth in precarious work, and often the cost of living is extremely high. So the fact that they are losing the support and often making less than $1,000 a month is going to make it very difficult for many of those people to continue to be able to pay their rent, food bills, and other critical costs. On the next slide, we look at some of the details around the actual deferrals. So just at the top 6 banks alone, over 500,000 mortgages have been deferred, worth over 130 billion. So the vast majority of those were 6-month deferrals, and they are now starting to hit the point where a lot of those mortgages are coming due. So for people who are having those mortgages who are being cut off, there will be some profound difficulties making those mortgages in the near future. The Bank of Canada estimates by the second half of 2021, mortgage arrears could double those of the 2008 financial crisis. So when we do compare to the historical implications of this, the consequences here, even when we look into the distant future, are going to be pretty substantial. These unmet housing debt obligations have profound implications. 20 times higher rate of serious psychological distress, obviously risk of homelessness. If you're unable to continue keeping your home, it often leads to interruption with employment, which really exacerbates the overall trend. On the next slide, just looking at, so a lot of people were not able to make rent payments in April and May in particular. A lot of the data more recently is still a little bit hard to come by, but about 10% of people said that they weren't making rent payments in April, around 7% of people in May. Most people who weren't making rent payments said they were making at least partial payments or were doing as much as they could. And a lot of the time, their goal is to make that up in the future. But what we know is that Canadians save on average about $852 a year. So in 2018, that was the average amount saved by a typical Canadian. Households paying 50% of their rent so far would have already owe about $3,000 depending on where they are in the country and all sorts of other factors. So if you typically are only saving $850 a year, you probably are going through a lot of difficulties tapping into your assets and relying on TFSAs and RRSPs. There's going to be a big backlog of people who are very focused on making their payments, and they will do all they can to do it. But as the time goes by, more and more of them are going to be missing more and more payments, which will put them at very high risk of eviction. And next slide. And the last piece I wanted to talk about was that as mortgage deferrals end, there has been a real emphasis on people who have tapped into their assets, including both their savings and their retirement savings, to be able to make these ends meet. So even with all these difficulties of people saying they haven't been able to do mortgage, there's a substantial chunk of these people who've also had to tap into their core financial assets. And even as people return to work, we see that those who are still relying on financial incentives are in worse and worse financial state. In the week of July 27th, 62% were concerned about their ability to pay bills and loans, versus August 24th, that increased to 72%. So people are starting to have already tapped fully into their lifelines and their assets. And so I think going forward, as more and more people are cut off from benefits, this is where we're going to start to see some pretty profound implications of the financial challenges. And I'm now going to pass this off to Ada, who will be taking us through the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Steve. Now we want to turn our focus on financial help services and the role it plays in our recovery. If we go to the next slide, to give some context, we see that low-income Canadians are bearing the brunt of the economic impacts of COVID due to 3 reasons. First, low-income Canadians are experiencing the highest rate of job loss. Second, some of these Canadians have complex finances, not only because of household cash flow issues, but also because many of them are on multiple governmental support programs, and the interaction between these programs create complicated situations. Lastly, low-income Canadians unfortunately face a lot of difficulty accessing financial support. Going into a bit more details for each on the next slide, low-income workers are disproportionately affected in terms of job loss or reduction in work hours. They're more likely to work in high-risk, low-wage jobs where physical distancing is challenging, and perhaps they have underlying health conditions that require them to reduce their work hours in light of the pandemic. On the left side of the page, this information on this chart is updated for August 2020. And you can see that higher wage workers have fully recovered in terms of work hours, while lower wage workers, those who make less than $15 an hour, continue to see reduction in actual hours worked. On the next slide, vulnerable Canadians are also facing complex financial situation. This table shows how CERB interacts with existing government programs. So for example, the key challenge with social assistance is that CERB is treated as earned income. What this means is that those who are on this program will receive CERB, but will also see a $900 reduction in social assistance benefit. As you can see, there are challenges with other programs as well, such as rent geared to income, where CERB is charged as rent, guaranteed income supplement, where CERB is considered unearned income, and income tax benefit, where the CERB is considered taxable income. What we can conclude from this is that those who are financially vulnerable are disproportionately affected because they will see clawbacks in their benefits. And when CERB ends, the challenges outlined on this page will still remain, but on top of that, the new EI system will introduce even more uncertainty and clawbacks, making a complicated situation even more complex. Unfortunately, many financially vulnerable Canadians struggle to access support. In a conducted survey in 2019, those who say they are somewhat or extremely stressed about their finances are 2.5 times more likely to have difficulty accessing support compared to those who are not stressed. The good news is community financial help services can help remove some of these barriers and give Canadians the support they need. For example, tax filing and benefit navigation services will really help address the issue of determining eligibility for benefits and understanding the interactions between different programs, as we've highlighted in the previous slides. One-on-one financial counseling is also helpful in providing impartial advice tailored to specific needs. It can help Canadians adjust to reduced income, as many had to do since the onset of COVID, and help them build long-term financial resilience. On the next slide, other Commonwealth countries have already realized the importance of community financial help services and have made significant investments towards that front. From the timeline here, you can see that since the economic shutdown in early March, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand have announced relief packages to support their economy. As the pandemic progressed, we see that Australia, UK, and New Zealand have each supplemented their relief packages with additional investment towards enhancing services, such as debt management programs and financial counseling services. For reference, these numbers are converted into Canadian dollars. So for Australia, a total of 19 million in investment, UK 65 million, and New Zealand 31 million investment towards that front. When we benchmark Canada against other countries, we see that Canada has done a phenomenal job in responding to COVID-19 by providing emergency income support for individuals and have increased funding towards non-for-profit organizations that deliver essential services such as food banks. If we focus on the long-term efforts in building financial resilience, we see that all four countries have some sort of national financial well-being strategy. But the UK, Australia, and New Zealand had taken it one step further and established national programs for monitoring financial health and have dedicated governmental department that funds and supports these initiatives. This all goes to say that the Canadian government plays a very key role in enhancing financial well-being. And if we go to the next slide, the point we want to drive home is that the government is in a unique position to plan and coordinate solutions across different sectors. But what is equally critical is the investment towards these efforts. To conclude, we want to share 5 actions that we feel should be an integral part of a comprehensive national financial well-being strategy. First, create a national program to monitor the financial health of Canadian households. Second, establish a center for excellence to conduct studies into financial challenges faced by Canadians and to use those outcomes to inform program planning. Third, expand the role and resources of FCAC to include financial empowerment for vulnerable people. Fourth, integrate financial empowerment concepts into existing federal programs. And lastly, invest in sustainable delivery for community financial empowerment supports. This would in turn enable vulnerable Canadians to achieve full financial inclusion. Thank you, and I will now pass it back to the Prosper team.
Thanks so much, Ada, and thanks to all the BCG team and Steve for this amazing work. We have been sharing this presentation with federal ministers' offices, and all of them have found it extremely valuable. Much of this information has not been rolled up for them to date, so this work has made a critical difference in informing key policymakers in the country. We've also been sharing it with some of our provincial government counterparts as well. So thank you so much. Your work is making a real difference right now. I think these findings reinforce what I'm sure many of you have been seeing in your communities. And armed with this evidence, we are actively working to raise awareness of the critical challenges facing households who've been financially impacted by the pandemic, and in particular, low and modest income households who have been disproportionately impacted economically, who have experienced the heaviest job losses, and for whom their jobs are the last to come back. In response to that, we're advocating actively for public investment in critical financial empowerment help services, services that have been shown to measurably improve key financial outcomes for individuals and households. To this end, we've been actively working with our partners in all sectors to engage the media, to raise awareness of the critical challenges facing low and moderate income households, and also the urgent need to scale up these services to help them at this moment. And the next 6 months really is a critical period. As I think you've learned from this presentation, there's a perfect storm brewing, essentially, of debt deferrals coming off, rent deferrals coming off, debts coming due with higher interest payments on them, and at the same time, many people still struggling with not having returned to their full income or earnings, and also having to transition into new and different benefits, which may or may not improve their situation. We're also engaging federal policymakers to encourage timely investment to meet the growing demand for these supports so that we can help those facing potential loss of benefits, evictions, and insolvency. The crisis is bad now, but it could get much worse over the next 6 months. As we experience the second wave of the pandemic, potential retraction in some areas of the economy, and the kind of cumulative erosion of households' financial health for those who are low and moderate income. We're also providing our community partners with materials to support their own advocacy and fund development efforts, recognizing that local community organizations and their local partners, whether they're in the business sector, the foundations, municipal and provincial partners, are all playing a critical role right now in meeting these needs and can be very effective advocates for raising awareness of the issues facing vulnerable Canadians and the need for the federal government to also join in this effort. In terms of what you can do, if we could move to the next slide. We would like you to add your voice and your support to our efforts if you agree with the case that we've presented here. One way that everybody can help is by following us on social media and sharing our content and helping to amplify our message. For those of you who have the capacity and are interested in reaching out to your local MPs, we would welcome any assistance that you can provide in highlighting the critical financial challenges facing vulnerable households, and expressions of support for urgent federal investment to scale up financial help services. And the focus of the services that we're really looking at are helping individuals to tax file, to navigate rapidly changing benefit systems, and financial counseling to help people build sustainable budgets, manage their debt, and make a financial plan to rebuild their financial stability, their health, and importantly, their resilience against future economic shocks. I think we've all learned from this pandemic how ill-prepared many Canadian households were for any kind of economic setback. Community financial help organizations are ready and willing to scale up these services across the country to meet the needs of Canadians in this critical period. And we know that many of their local partners from all sectors are lending their help and resources to this effort, but we can't do this alone. We need the federal government to do its part. And I think if we are all truly in this together, then it has to mean the recovery, not just the pandemic. And right now, too many low and moderate income Canadians are seeing their finances deteriorate, even as those of us who have stable jobs and incomes at the moment are seeing our financial situations improve. So thank you very much for joining us today to learn more about these issues and how you can help. And I'd like to thank once again our amazing team from the Boston Consulting Group and Steve Eyre from Common Good Strategies for their amazing work, and turn it back to Glenna now to lead us through the final part of our agenda, the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. And once again, thank you as well to Brian, Abby, Steve, and Ada for this really rich and detailed presentation. We have had some questions coming in, and I'll invite everyone listening in. If you have other questions that you've been thinking about, please feel free to share them with us in the question box in the control panel. We'll include as many as we are able to in the next 15 minutes or so. And then if there's anything else that we're not able to answer, we'll do our best to get answers to you offline. I see there's a couple of logistical questions, and I'll just address one of them right off the top. You may have noticed that there's some lovely footnote numbers in many of the slides that have been presented, and those all have their own sources. And when you see this deck, you'll see that there's going to be an appendix with a lot of full detail on where you can get more follow-up information on those footnotes. So that will be coming to you in your email shortly in the next few days. So Steve, I have a couple of questions for you and the Boston Consulting Group team for different population groups, if there's any insight or thoughts that you can provide. We have a question about middle class. We know obviously there's a lot of importance to talking about low income group, but do we know anything about what's likely to be affected in terms of the middle class population?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, and anyone else feel free to jump in if there's anything you want to add. Anyone else who is working on the research. A lot of the issues in terms of the middle class is, so CIBC did a survey that I thought was quite interesting, where they surveyed people about their difficulty making rent and mortgage payments, and they asked them their annual income from the previous year. And it was probably the only time we'll ever see that people who were actually making more income reported more difficulty making rent and mortgage payments. So obviously people who were in the middle class, they have substantial, expectation that their income would remain about where it was. And when that wasn't the case, they're often the ones who are in the most significant financial difficulty, because especially those who did not, they were in reasonably expensive apartments either, or paying higher amounts of mortgages, but not quite enough to save a substantial amount. Like they're often the ones in the most challenging financial situation right now, because of the complete lack of expectation that their income would drop to the level for this long that it has. So for those who were often lower income, $500 a week from CERB was a pretty substantial portion of their income being replaced, whereas those middle income workers who have still seen about 15% of their hours eliminated, and some of that's very concentrated, they're often the ones who are really struggling. And I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in as well on any of that.
Yeah, sure. Just one additional point as well. I think it's not only about thinking, I think, in terms of like lower and middle class, but also the distinction that Steve was making about, I think, just homeowners versus renters is really important. just because I think in general, a homeowner like who might have a mortgage, there's a bit better incentives for like the bank who's lending the mortgage and the person who owes it to come up with various agreements that are sustainable for the person who might be having some financial difficulty, just because it can be very costly for a bank who has a delinquent mortgage. That being said, though, for renters, regardless of your sort of like middle income or lower income, just because rents are so high in places of the country, for renters, that incentive isn't quite as strong for them to work together. And actually, there's a lot of incentives that can, push the landlord to actually want to evict a renter, for example. So I think not only thinking about it just in terms of low income versus, middle income, but also just thinking about like, renter versus homeowner is extremely important layer to that.
Thank you, Brian and Steve. That's very insightful, and bringing us back to the data you shared as well on potential impacts for renters and the need for various eviction protections and so forth. So thank you. We had another question, and I don't know, perhaps Steve or Ada, if this would be for you, but we had a question about the impact on seniors. Population. I know you referred to the guaranteed income supplement, for example, as one of the benefits that has some challenging interaction with CERB, but is there any other impact we could talk about for the senior population broadly?
Yeah, there's two ways to look at that. One is seniors are less likely to have lost their jobs because of the pandemic. So many of them are more likely to be retired, so there is less immediate income loss. So they are less likely to be relying on a variety of the income supports that especially are going through fundamental changes. On the flip side, a lot of seniors are likely to have increased costs. So if they're self-isolating at home, they may be less able to shop grocery sales. They may be using Instacart or other things that come with additional costs to be able to actually get food if they're uncomfortable going outside of the home. So there is a lot of cases where, especially those with disabilities who might have additional difficulties as well, or people who have pre-existing conditions, there might be additional expenses now. So I think when we look at seniors, there's often a lot of additional challenges based on the expense side, even if by and large, on average, they have had less income decreases than some other groups in the population. Obviously, for seniors who are working, many of them were doing that because they needed the money, and if they are unable to work now, that definitely puts them in a difficult financial situation.
And I just want to add another point, which is some of the senior population, because a lot of the community support are moving virtually or have some sort of virtual platform, a lot of the senior population are unable to adjust to that as well. And so in terms of the support that they can get, it's actually a lot more challenging for them as well.
Yeah, and if I could just build on Ada's point, seniors are a particularly large user group for community tax clinics. And many of those are not operating. We know that only 7% continued operating after the lockdown. And 740,000 plus low-income Canadians rely on those tax clinics every year to tax file them and connect them to their benefits. So seniors are going to be heavily impacted, and without help to tax file, those who do need help risk losing their benefits over time. The governments have been very good about trying to extend people's benefits, even if they haven't managed to tax file yet. But even though they've been able to do it for this year, it's unlikely they'll feel comfortable extending that for another year. So getting tax clinics up and running again is going to be a very critical issue for many low-income seniors across the country.
Absolutely, thank you. We have a few more questions coming in about a couple different population groups. We have some questions around gender. For example, do we know anything about these impacts for men versus women? And do we know anything about the percentage of men versus women who are receiving CERB? So again, Steve, would you know who in your team is best placed to respond to those questions?
In terms of, I'm not sure if anyone has any thoughts on the percentage of women receiving CERB. We did have, some slides, and I think one or more extended deck about women with children have really borne the brunt of a lot of the job losses and hour losses, especially we haven't seen the most recent labor force survey, so we don't know with the return to school whether that has started to shift this trend. But over the course of the summer, women with children really were bearing the brunt of a lot of the financial difficulties. Brian, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered it perfectly. Really, it is on the employment side, exactly like you were saying, Steve. It's the women with young children, and the younger the children that a woman has, the more impactful it is, are really experiencing the much harder challenge in terms of like facing more unemployment. I think just, that's a lot of it's because the industries that were most affected, such as service industries and things like that, tend to have had employment that was skewed towards women in the first place. I think going forward as well, there was also some pretty interesting statistics done just around the additional burden of childcare that's being placed. So like as more kids are, even still now that schools are back, like learning from home if they've chosen to do online classes, that creates an additional burden of childcare on the family, which tends to be skewed towards the woman. So even if job opportunities are starting to come back, I think like we highlighted with the situation with Clara, it can be even harder for women to actually go out and find those jobs and do that job hunting. So definitely an area of concern there on the gender side.
And particularly, there's a lot of challenges uniquely on single parents right now, which are disproportionately women. So if you're isolating, if you previously had grandparents who might watch the children, trying to balance keeping your children schooling up or education and other recreational activities with work when there's no childcare, you're worried about sharing that responsibility with other family members or friends, has really the impact in that area is huge. And we know in many ways that that population group had difficulties before this. So I mean, I think in terms of the wage outcomes, the financial outcomes, but as also the outcomes on their children, there will be profound implications for quite a while, and we'll need continued investment for years really to help address some of the outcomes that we've seen in that area.
Thank you. And Steve, that's an interesting situation to reflect on in thinking about some of the questions and comments that have come in around multi-generation households that have been created as a result of this situation. So some comments around university or college students who have now moved back home with mom and dad, and maybe for them that's a bit better situation, but maybe not so much for mom and dad who weren't expecting to have their young adult children back in the house again.
I would say on the young adults, really, when we look at youth unemployment right now, at any point in the last 30 or 40 years, the youth unemployment rate we have now would be the highest. I mean, it peaked at about 29%. Now, after some improvement over the summer, we're at 23-24% youth unemployment. Really and truly unprecedented. When we look at even small increases in youth unemployment rate have lifetime impacts on earnings. So previous recessions that were nowhere near as severe as this had by the time that youth recovered, on average they'd lost 5% of their lifetime earnings. And I think when we look at that area, it's an area that if we don't substantially invest, the consequences will again ripple for a very long time. And I think we haven't seen necessarily progress on youth unemployment that we might like. And when you combine that with the ever-growing cost of university, of course, many people will return home because of it. And I think some data from the United States recently said that their data shows already there's a big boost in the percentage of youth living at home because there has people just can't afford their apartments anymore, so they're getting rid of their apartments and moving back in. And it really was the biggest boost in youth living at home they've ever recorded. I haven't seen anything similar for Canada.
That's a sobering set of statistics there, Steve, that you've added. Thank you for that added context. We have a question around what role banks and credit unions can play in the situation right now. I'm not sure, Ada, perhaps if you'd like to respond to that, or perhaps Liz.
Ada, do you want to take a crack first, or shall I?
I feel like you should, Liz.
Okay, no problem. Thanks very much. So the role of banks and credit unions. So first of all, obviously analyzing your customers' needs in this moment and understanding that some are going to be particularly hard hit. And that essentially it's a question of time. So people just need more time to be able to right their financial ship, depending on what sector they work in and how they've been impacted in their job and earnings. So I think the job that everybody has is to help people buy time and to stay afloat until the situation improves and they can get back on their feet. So, you know, the 6-month deferrals that banks and credit unions had agreed to provide to for mortgages and debts are now expiring. And the question arises of how banks and credit unions are going to treat those customers who aren't yet ready or able to resume payments on their debts. So I think most banks and credit unions are probably treating this on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's in everybody's interest for them to be as understanding as possible and accommodating to help people work out a plan and a timeline that will help them bridge this critical period to when their earnings resume and they can resume their financial obligations. So I think that's the most important thing. Secondly, I think banks and credit unions have access to amazing data on how their customers are doing and where they are feeling the pinch and the pain points. And it would be helpful if the more of that information that they could share publicly without, of course, violating privacy agreements with their consumers and customers, the more equipped policymakers will be and service providers in the community to understand the needs of Canadians and to help meet them. I don't think banks and credit unions can meet people's financial help needs all on their own, but they have a role to play, and we can play our role more effectively if we understand more about what people are experiencing. So thanks.
Yes, thank you. We have, and we're hearing some comments as well, not so much in the questions area, but some comments around, yeah, concerns echoing what you just said there, Liz, around continuing struggles to regain the wages and the employment and the necessity for these types of lenient or accommodating approaches. So thank you. For the research team, we have a question on if you're able to speak to the impact in northern or remote communities at all, or if we have information around the impact among Indigenous communities in Canada.
Brian, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yes, sir. So yeah, sure. So just to be totally transparent, that wasn't a huge focus in the geographical separation of our analysis. We did it very much on a national level. But one thing I would point to is that StatsCan, in the last 3 or 4 labor force surveys, has really done an amazing job of highlighting different disparities among different groups, among different populations, genders, and things like that. So I definitely point to the Canadian Labor Force Survey, which I think is actually going to be updated on Friday as well for the month of September, because they have some really good information on, at least from the employment side, how people's incomes and things like that are being affected.
Just to add to that, so in terms of Indigenous peoples, so the Labor Force Survey does regularly track how many the employment outcomes of Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous Canadians. Indigenous people have had more job losses and have been recovering their jobs less quickly than others, as part of the government's announcement in terms of over the summer of their fiscal snapshot. They also highlight as well that Indigenous people were less likely to be applying for a lot of the benefits programs they highlighted. So it seemed like they were eligible but not applying, which I think really speaks to the critical role that financial supports and helps to help people realize that these programs exist and give them everything they need to apply is a critical area of emphasis. And then obviously, in the rural area, as jobs, are increasingly reliant on broadband. There's clearly an issue in rural communities. By and large, the analysis that StatsCan has been focused on sort of major cities versus smaller cities, and we can see like a lot of the major cities that have their downtown cores hollow out have the biggest increase in unemployment rate. So like, you know, they went like cities like Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver went from having the lowest unemployment rates in the country to among the highest, whereas mid-sized cities have had less increase in their unemployment rates. So it's the analysis on rural communities and northern communities, I think, has been could be added to.
Could be elaborated more. All right, thank you, Stephen, Brian, and that's a really good encouragement to continue to look at public data sources that are available. And I'll reiterate again for folks listening in that we do have the full roster of data sources that the research team here has referred to. So you'll receive that in the slide deck, which will be coming to you in the next couple of days. We'll be also sharing the video recording for today, so you can feel free to re-listen or share out to anyone else who you think would like to know more. Thank you again. We know that your time is very valuable with all of the great work that you are doing in the field, and we're very glad that you've been able to spend this hour with us. I want to thank our team who has been so valuable today, Abby, Ada, Brian, and Steve, as well as Liz here at Prosper Canada. I'll leave our contact information up. If you have any questions about this event or any of our upcoming events or any of our resources, please feel free to send us an email. Please find us on the web, and please subscribe to our newsletter. We're very happy to share with you all our up and coming resources and news and events as they unfold. So thank you again to everyone listening in on the line. We hope your work continues to go well, and thank you very much for everything that you do. Have a great afternoon.
Just one addition quickly, if we have one more second.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Steve.
So the the Government of Canada does release regular stats on the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit statistics. So they've just updated relatively recently what is available there now. So there is a detailed breakdown by province, age, and gender. So I know those topics were all coming up. So these are relatively new stats. I'm not entirely sure when they were released for, but there's a treasure trove of new data they've put out there that will hopefully allow some of the questions that were asked to be covered a bit more. So that was under the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit Statistics page from the Government of Canada.
And they have a gender-based analysis that they publish of their entire COVID response strategy, which we can provide a link to people afterwards.
Absolutely, we'll add it in. Thank you both. All right, I think that closes it out from our end. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Gunnar.
Thanks.